The world decided early what Bumpy Johnson was supposed to be. He had no degrees to point to, no classrooms to reference, no polished language that reassured powerful ears. To outsiders, that absence meant something was missing. In elite circles, education had already been defined, guarded, and weaponized. If you did not speak it, you were assumed incapable of thinking deeply at all. Harlem men learned early how dangerous that assumption could be. Underestimation created blind spots wide enough to build empires inside, and Bumpy lived comfortably within one of them. He was spoken about as if instinct alone guided him, as if survival erased thought, as if intelligence required permission. But Harlem knew better. The neighborhood had watched too many credentialed men fold under pressure to confuse schooling with wisdom. Bumpy absorbed information the way streets absorb footsteps, repeated, layered, remembered. His education came from consequence, from watching deals collapse and alliances shift, from understanding that memory was more reliable than paper, and that forgetting was often fatal. People mistook his quiet for simplicity. They confused restraint with ignorance. In truth, he was collecting patterns. He noticed who spoke when they felt safe and who stayed silent when they weren't. He tracked which promises aged well and which decayed quickly under stress. That kind of intelligence had no syllabus. It could not be taught without cost, and it could not be measured without context. Elite observers saw only what fit their framework. A man without formal education was easy to dismiss, and that dismissal became his advantage. While others postured, he listened. While others chased recognition, he built continuity. Harlem understood that brilliance was not evenly distributed, only selectively acknowledged. The city carried long memories of who was allowed to be called smart and who was not, and it learned how to use that imbalance to survive. Bumpy never tried to correct anyone. Correction invites scrutiny, and scrutiny attracts attention. He let assumptions stand because they worked in his favor. The less he was expected to know, the more freely others revealed themselves. By the time people realized he was operating at a different level, they were already inside a system they did not recognize as his. This gap between reputation and reality is where the story truly begins. To understand his intelligence, you have to abandon the comfort of classrooms and credentials. You have to step into an environment where lessons are permanent and mistakes echo. You have to walk the streets that shaped him, where memory was currency and awareness meant survival. Harlem was already waiting, ready to teach what institutions could not, and ready to prove that some minds grow sharper precisely because no one is watching them closely enough. Harlem educated without ceremony. It taught through repetition, pressure, and memory, and it did not offer second chances. The streets were classrooms where every mistake left a mark, sometimes permanent. Bars functioned as lecture halls after midnight, back rooms as seminars where power was discussed without notes. Nothing was theoretical. Every idea was tested immediately against reality, and reality graded harshly. Bumpy learned early that survival depended on understanding systems, not individuals. Faces changed, structures remained. He watched how money moved faster than loyalty, how fear traveled quicker than rumor, how silence could stabilize situations better than threats. He saw that chaos was not random. It followed patterns shaped by greed, insecurity, and timing. Harlem rewarded those who noticed this and punished those who didn't. Numbers, runners taught economics without calling it that. Supply, demand, trust, and risk played out daily on street corners. If you misread people, you lost everything. If you misjudged timing, you didn't get a second lesson. Bumpy studied outcomes, not intentions. Intentions were stories people told themselves. Outcomes were truth. He remembered who paid on time, who delayed, who disappeared when pressure arrived. Memory became his ledger. Mistakes in Harlem were expensive. There were no appeals, no revisions. Learning happened quickly because it had to. Bumpy adapted faster than most because he paid attention longer. He learned when to step forward and when to let situations exhaust themselves. He saw that force was useful only when it served structure. Used carelessly, it destroyed systems instead of reinforcing them. The city taught adaptability. Rules existed, but they bent depending on circumstance. That flexibility was survival, not weakness. Bumpy absorbed this instinctively. He built understanding by watching how agreements evolved under stress. Who held when things tightened? Who fractured? Harlem showed him that stability came from managing expectations, not controlling people outright. Experience became currency. Respect followed consistency, not charisma. Bumpy didn't need to announce intelligence because results announced it for him. Over time, people noticed that situations around him calmed rather than escalated. That was not luck. It was learned restraint, sharpened by years of observation. This was an education without diplomas, but it produced clarity. Harlem taught him to organize disorder, to see how pieces fit together even when they looked chaotic. That understanding would become the foundation for everything that followed, long before anyone realized a system was forming at all. It was education shaped by listening. Bumpy paid attention to tone, pauses, and what was avoided entirely. He noticed how power revealed itself through comfort, not volume. Who leaned back, who waited. Who rushed decisions because fear pressed close. Harlem trained him to read rooms the way others read books, scanning for meaning hidden between gestures and glances. Over time, this learning compounded. Patterns connected across blocks, across years. He saw how a single disruption could ripple through an entire neighborhood, how stability depended on invisible agreements being honored quietly. That awareness would soon allow him to arrange order where others only saw disorder, preparing him to shape systems rather than react to crises. Nothing about this education felt safe or fair, but it was thorough. Harlem demanded engagement, punished arrogance, and rewarded patience. By the time Bumpy began organizing chaos instead of merely surviving it, he carried a doctorate in reality, earned through endurance. The classroom had been unforgiving, but it had prepared him completely. It taught him not just how to live, but how to see, and that vision would soon be tested beyond Harlem's borders, in ways that demanded structure, foresight, and control. Those lessons waited, fully formed, ready to be applied when opportunity and pressure finally collided. They would define what came next, long before anyone recognized the system taking shape inside Harlem itself. Nothing about Bumpy Johnson's system lived on paper. There were no contracts to file, no charts to audit, no records to subpoena. That absence was intentional. Paper created evidence, and evidence created vulnerability. Memory, on the other hand, lived where authority could not easily reach. In Harlem, survival depended on what people remembered, not what they signed. Bumpy organized order through reputation. Everyone knew the cost of breaking an agreement because they remembered what happened the last time someone tried. Consequences did not need to be announced. They were carried in stories, in lowered voices, in glances that lingered a moment too long. The system enforced itself because everyone understood it, even if no one could point to it directly. Agreements were spoken, not written. That made them flexible. If circumstances changed, terms could adjust without collapsing the structure. Rigid systems snapped under pressure. Bumpy's bent. He understood that survival environments punished inflexibility more than dishonesty. What mattered was balance, not purity. Rules existed to prevent chaos, not to satisfy ideals. Timing was his primary tool. He knew when to delay decisions until emotions cooled and when to act before momentum built. He allowed situations to reveal their natural direction before intervening. This patience created the illusion of passivity, which protected the system from scrutiny. People assumed nothing was happening because nothing was visible. Reputation carried information faster than documents ever could. A man's history mattered more than his promises. Bumpy tracked behavior across years, remembering who honored commitments under stress and who faltered. That memory replaced paperwork. It allowed him to predict outcomes without forcing them. Systems run on predictability, and predictability came from observation. This kind of order adapted quickly. When pressure shifted, the system shifted with it. No approvals were required. No hierarchy needed to be consulted. Decisions flowed through understanding rather than command. That efficiency was invisible to outsiders who mistook the lack of structure for disorder. In reality, it was a design optimized for uncertainty. Violence existed within this system, but it was controlled, deliberate, and rare. Force was a tool, not a foundation. Bumpy understood that overuse destroyed trust, and trust was the real infrastructure. By limiting violence, he preserved the system's credibility. People believed consequences would come when necessary, which made constant enforcement unnecessary. Order without paper left no trail. That protected everyone involved. Authorities could not dismantle what they could not see. Rivals could not copy what was never written down. The system survived because it resisted definition. It functioned through shared understanding rather than formal recognition. This intelligence was practical, not theoretical. It measured success by stability, not elegance. It valued outcomes over explanations. Bumpy did not need language to justify his system. He needed it to work. And it did, quietly, consistently, resilient against forces that crushed more visible organizations. In time, observers would try to describe similar systems using academic language, reducing lived practice into models and diagrams. But those explanations came later. What existed in Harlem was already complete, operating efficiently without validation. The absence of paper was not a flaw. It was the feature that allowed order to survive unseen, waiting to be compared to systems that required permission to exist. Those systems depended on acknowledgement, funding, and legitimacy, all fragile under pressure. Harlem's did not. It lived in people, in habits, in expectations shaped over years. That difference mattered. It explains why his methods endured long enough to be noticed later, when scholars finally looked backward, trying to name what had already been functioning, quietly, efficiently beyond their reach. The comparison would come soon, forcing classrooms to confront streets, and theories to confront outcomes, revealing how much intelligence thrives where no one bothers to certify it without permission or applause ever. Institutions decide what intelligence looks like long before they decide who possesses it. Measurement requires familiarity, and familiarity protects hierarchy. Anything that doesn't fit existing frameworks is treated as anomaly rather than achievement. Bumpy Johnson's methods lived entirely outside those frameworks. They were too informal, too fluid, too uncomfortable to examine without questioning the authority of the systems doing the examining. Academic intelligence prefers clarity, documentation, and attribution. It needs models that can be replicated safely, without consequence. What Bumpy built could not be separated from risk. It was shaped by pressure, violence, and memory, elements that made scholars uneasy. To acknowledge his intelligence would have meant admitting that effective systems could exist without credentials, oversight, or institutional permission. That admission threatened the idea that knowledge must be sanctioned to be valid. So it was ignored, not because it was invisible, but because it was inconvenient. People in power often recognize threats long before they admit them publicly. Bumpy's system worked precisely because it bypassed traditional structures. It solved problems those structures failed to manage. That effectiveness made it dangerous to study. Studying it would raise questions no one wanted to answer. What qualifies as knowledge has always been shaped by who benefits from the definition. Intelligence that reinforces existing authority is celebrated. Intelligence that exposes its limitations is minimized or erased. Harlem's systems did not need approval to function, and that independence made them suspect. Silence became the easiest response. Silence protects reputations. It allows institutions to maintain the illusion of exclusivity. Recognition follows power, not truth. Scholars studied what they were funded to study. They examined systems that could be safely abstracted, sanitized of consequence. Bumpy's intelligence resisted that process. It could not be removed from its environment without losing meaning. To measure it accurately would require acknowledging the failures of formal governance, law enforcement, and economic theory. That acknowledgement carried professional risk. So the intelligence remained unmeasured, spoken about only in margins and whispers. It existed in practice, not in journals. Harlem residents understood its effectiveness intuitively. Outsiders dismissed it as criminal instinct rather than strategic design. That dismissal was comfortable. It preserved existing narratives about where brilliance lived and who was allowed to possess it. This erasure was not accidental, it was structural. Institutions have always struggled to value knowledge that emerges from survival rather than study. Bumpy's methods forced a confrontation between lived intelligence and certified intelligence. Avoiding that confrontation preserved hierarchy. Silence became policy. Yet silence cannot erase outcomes. Stability persisted where chaos was expected. Order appeared without formal governance. Over time, the contradiction grew harder to ignore. Systems thinkers began noticing patterns that theory alone could not explain. Informal governance, network control, adaptive order began appearing in academic language, stripped of origin. The moment of recognition did not come as praise. It arrived as curiosity. As researchers looked for answers to modern complexity, they stumbled toward ideas long practiced elsewhere. They began studying what they once dismissed, often without acknowledging where those ideas had lived first. The intelligence nobody wanted to measure had outlasted the refusal. That shift marked the beginning of discomfort. When academia finally noticed, it was forced to confront a truth it had avoided. Intelligence does not require permission to exist. Some of the most effective systems operate precisely because they are ignored. And once noticed, they cannot be unseen. The hierarchy trembled slightly, not from collapse, but from realization. What had been erased was now relevant. What had been dismissed was now necessary. The silence that once protected reputations was beginning to crack, preparing the ground for a reckoning that would arrive quietly, reshaping how knowledge itself would be defined. Decades after Harlem had already solved its problems quietly, scholars began asking questions that sounded familiar. They gave them new names, wrapped them in neutral language, and placed them safely inside textbooks. Network control, informal governance, equilibrium. Concepts designed to explain how order emerges without central authority. What they were describing felt new, only because they had not been paying attention when it was happening in real time. These theories emerged from frustration. Traditional models failed to explain why certain communities remained stable under pressure while others collapsed, why formal institutions struggled where informal ones adapted. Researchers searched for answers in diagrams and simulations, unaware that the blueprint had already existed, lived, and evolved in Harlem. It had simply never been labeled as intelligence worth studying. The irony was sharp. Academia arrived after survival had already proven the concept. What Bumpy practiced daily became case studies decades later, stripped of names and context. His methods were reframed as insights, abstracted from consequence. The danger that shaped them was removed so they could be discussed comfortably. Old systems were renamed to sound respectable, making them palatable to institutions that once dismissed their existence entirely. Credit rarely travels backward. By the time these ideas gained traction, the architect was gone. Influence outlived recognition. Scholars debated frameworks that mirrored decisions made long ago on street corners and in back rooms. They analyzed stability without acknowledging the cost at which it was learned. That omission softened the truth, but it did not erase it. What was studied was never the man, but the effect. Informal systems that regulated behavior without enforcement, power distributed through reputation rather than command, balance maintained by memory instead of policy. These were not theoretical exercises for Bumpy. They were necessities. He did not test models. He lived inside them, adjusting constantly to pressure, reading outcomes instead of predictions. The delay mattered. Recognition came only when similar challenges appeared in places scholars could not ignore. Modern complexity forced a reevaluation of rigid structures. Suddenly, adaptive systems looked less like disorder and more like intelligence. Researchers began looking backward, searching history for examples that fit their theories. Harlem fit, even if its name was rarely mentioned. This selective acknowledgement preserved comfort. By studying the system without naming its source, academia avoided confronting uncomfortable truths about who produces knowledge and why. It allowed institutions to claim discovery rather than admission. The blueprint was studied long after the building had stood, weathered storms, and proven durable. Yet the resemblance was undeniable. Anyone who looked closely could see it. The same emphasis on timing, the same reliance on trust, the same refusal to centralize control. What had been dismissed as criminal instinct now appeared as strategic foresight. That realization carried quiet anger for those who understood where it came from. Awe, too, at how thoroughly lived experience had anticipated theory. This was not validation in the way Harlem might have wanted. It was delayed recognition, filtered through language that made it safe. Still, it mattered. It marked the moment when reality forced theory to catch up, when survival intelligence entered classrooms under different names. And once the ideas were inside those rooms, they could not be fully separated from their origins. The comparison became inevitable. Scholars traced patterns further back, inching closer to the truth they had avoided. The distance between street and seminar narrowed. The moment approached when elite institutions would have to confront the uncomfortable source of their insights, setting the stage for recognition at the highest levels, where names could no longer be avoided and origins could no longer be erased. Elite institutions rarely look down until something stops working. For decades, rigid structures promised control, predictability, and authority. They functioned well when environments were stable and pressure was limited. But as systems grew more complex, those guarantees weakened. Plans failed faster. Hierarchies slowed decisions. Models designed for order collapsed under uncertainty. When control slipped, curiosity replaced confidence. That curiosity led scholars and leaders toward systems they once dismissed. Informal networks proved resilient where formal governance fractured. Decisions made close to consequences outperformed those filtered through layers of approval. Survival systems shaped by necessity scaled in ways planned ones could not. Elites study what they can no longer control, not out of admiration, but need. Bumpy Johnson's method suddenly felt familiar to modern leadership theory. Decentralized authority, trust-based enforcement, adaptive response to pressure. These ideas appeared in management books and strategy seminars as innovations, yet they echoed principles long practiced elsewhere. What had once been labeled criminal instinct now looked like anticipatory intelligence. Time validated what credentials dismissed. As institutions confronted volatility they could not regulate, humility followed. Leaders began acknowledging that intelligence did not always originate within sanctioned spaces. Effective systems emerged where risk was immediate and failure unforgiving. Harlem had always been such a place. Its lessons arrived early because they had to. This shift was not generous. It was reactive. Recognition arrived only after necessity forced it. Elites reframed informal systems as case studies, removing context to make them teachable. Yet the core truth remained intact. Bumpy's approach worked because it prioritized awareness over authority, timing over force, memory over documentation. Modern complexity exposed the limits of rigid planning. Static rules could not respond quickly enough. Centralized control failed to account for local knowledge. Informal systems thrived because they trusted people closest to the problem. That trust created speed. Speed created stability. Stability created influence. Institutions began borrowing these principles cautiously. Network thinking entered boardrooms. Adaptive leadership replaced command models. Equilibrium became something maintained, not imposed. Each concept mirrored lived practices that had been ignored for generations. The gap between theory and reality narrowed, even if acknowledgement lagged. For viewers who felt overlooked, this moment carried vindication. Intelligence had been present all along, simply unrecognized by those who defined legitimacy. Reflection followed. If systems built without permission endured, what else had been dismissed prematurely? What other knowledge waited outside institutional gates? This chapter marks the turn from analysis toward legacy. Once elites began studying what they once ignored, the conversation shifted from whether such intelligence existed to how it could be preserved. The question was no longer about education, but about recognition. Bumpy Johnson's system no longer needed defense. Time had done that work. What remained was understanding how such intelligence survives, spreads, and shapes the future after its originator is gone, quietly influencing spaces that once refused to see it at all. It also forced institutions to confront their own limits. By studying adaptive systems, they admitted uncertainty had outgrown prediction. Control gave way to responsiveness. Leadership shifted from command to interpretation, from issuing orders to reading environments. These ideas felt new in academic halls, yet they carried the familiar weight of lived necessity. Harlem had practiced responsiveness because delay meant loss. Bumpy's intelligence anticipated this shift not through theory, but exposure. As elites absorbed these lessons, they rarely acknowledged the source, but the influence persisted. The system's logic traveled quietly, shaping curricula, strategy, and policy without attribution. That quiet spread ensured the ideas endured, no longer tied to one man or one place, but embedded in how modern institutions learn to survive complexity itself. This belated recognition closed one chapter, while opening another, where legacy replaced denial, and intelligence finally stood on its own terms without credentials, permission, or apology ever. Education was never something that could be granted or revoked in Harlem. It was earned, absorbed, carried quietly, and guarded closely because it could not be replaced. Bumpy Johnson's intelligence belonged to that category. It did not depend on access to buildings or approval from institutions. No one could take it away because no one had given it to him in the first place. It lived in how he moved, how he listened, how he remembered. Classrooms teach theory before consequence. Harlem reversed that order. Learning arrived only after survival demanded it. Wisdom grew where necessity applied pressure, where mistakes carried weight, and where adaptation meant living another day. That kind of education left marks no certificate could represent. It shaped instincts, sharpened judgment, and created understanding that endured long after circumstances changed. Bumpy's intelligence endured because it was portable. It did not rely on titles, networks of privilege, or recognition. It lived in his ability to read environments, to sense shifts before they announced themselves, to understand people without needing explanations. This made it timeless. Even as Harlem changed, the principles he operated by remained relevant. Timing still mattered. Memory still mattered. Restraint still mattered. For viewers who built themselves without permission, this story resonates deeply. It challenges the idea that learning follows a single path. Education does not begin in classrooms. It begins wherever attention is paid, wherever consequences teach more honestly than instruction. Some knowledge survives oppression precisely because it has to. It is refined under pressure, strengthened by denial, and preserved through use rather than validation. Credentials expire, institutions evolve, access shifts, but intelligence shaped by necessity adapts. Bumpy's education was immune to gatekeeping because it did not ask for entry. It did not depend on systems that could exclude him. That autonomy made it powerful. It also made it difficult to acknowledge within traditional frameworks. Yet its impact proved undeniable over time. This reframing invites a larger question. Who gets to define what learning looks like? Who decides which intelligence matters? History shows that definitions often serve those already in power. Knowledge that emerges from margins is frequently dismissed until it becomes unavoidable. Bumpy's story forces a reconsideration. It suggests that intelligence exists wherever people are forced to solve real problems with limited resources. Legacy outlasts credentials. Degrees may open doors, but they do not guarantee understanding. Bumpy's education left no transcript, yet it shaped a system studied decades later. That endurance matters. It validates experiences often minimized or ignored. It reminds viewers that worth is not measured by recognition, but by effect. As the story moves toward closure, the focus shifts from comparison to reflection. What remains after titles fade? What survives when institutions change? Bumpy's intelligence answers quietly. It remains embedded in outcomes, in systems that work, in lessons passed without formal language. It persists because it was never dependent on approval. This chapter prepares the ground for understanding legacy not as fame, but as influence that continues without attribution. The education that could not be taken away becomes the foundation for everything that followed. It frames Bumpy not as an exception, but as evidence. Evidence that learning shaped by necessity can rival, and sometimes surpass, what formal education produces. In that realization, pride replaces resentment. Validation replaces doubt. Viewers are left with a deeper respect for paths that never receive acknowledgement yet quietly shape the world. This understanding softens the need for recognition. It emphasizes continuity over credit. And it leads naturally to the final reflection. where intelligence is no longer debated, measured, or compared, but accepted as something that reveals itself fully only when no one is watching. Still working, still shaping outcomes, long after credentials have been forgotten entirely. Intelligence does not announce itself with titles or applause. It reveals itself slowly, through outcomes that hold when attention fades. Bumpy Johnson's intelligence lived there, in results that endured long after his name stopped circulating. What mattered was not how he was described, but what remained stable because of him. His system worked because it was built for reality, not recognition. It did not depend on approval, documentation, or validation. It depended on understanding how people behave under pressure. That understanding proved durable. Even as conditions changed, the principles held. Timing mattered, memory mattered, restraint mattered. These were not fashionable ideas, they were effective ones. When no one is watching, intelligence becomes honest. It stops performing. It stops explaining itself. It simply operates. Bumpy did not need witnesses to confirm his decisions. The absence of chaos was enough. Harlem felt the difference, even when it could not articulate it. Streets remained intact. Relationships stabilized. Life continued. That continuity was the measure. Recognition is optional. Survival is not. Bumpy understood this distinction intuitively. He never chased acknowledgement because acknowledgement invites challenge. He trusted outcomes to speak quietly. Over time, they did. Systems he shaped continued functioning without his presence. That endurance mattered more than any credit he never received. Some minds are measured too late. By the time institutions began studying ideas that mirrored his approach, the conditions that produced them had already passed. What remained was influence without attribution. The system outlived the man. That is the clearest signal of intelligence. It leaves structures behind that do not collapse when attention moves elsewhere. This reframing changes how power is understood. Power is not always the ability to command. Sometimes it is the ability to arrange conditions so that force becomes unnecessary. Bumpy's intelligence reduced conflict by anticipating it. He did not eliminate danger. He redirected it until it lost momentum. That subtlety separated survival from spectacle. Learning follows the same pattern. It is not defined by where it begins, but by what it produces. Education that cannot function outside institutions is fragile. Education shaped by necessity adapts. Bumpy's learning traveled with him. It applied wherever pressure appeared. That portability made it timeless. For viewers reflecting on their own paths, this realization carries weight. Intelligence does not require permission. It reveals itself in how problems are solved when resources are limited and stakes are high. It shows up in systems that work without supervision. It becomes visible only when results accumulate quietly. This story closes without drama because its lesson does not need one. It invites reconsideration rather than celebration. What if intelligence has always existed beyond our measurements? What if some of the most effective minds remain unseen because visibility was never the goal? Bumpy Johnson's legacy answers without speaking. His intelligence was never proven in classrooms or documents. It was proven in stability, in absence, in nights that passed without incident. Harlem remembered because life continued. That continuation was the evidence. Real intelligence leaves systems behind. It does not demand acknowledgement. It waits for the world to catch up. And when it does, recognition arrives not as praise, but as understanding. That understanding lingers, reshaping how power, learning, and worth are defined. When the story ends, what remains is not a man, but a question. If intelligence looks like this when no one is watching, how much of it have we missed? and how many minds are still shaping outcomes quietly, waiting to be understood only after their work is already complete.